Notebook 10. The Verdun Charnel House. From the 26th of April, 1916, to the 19th of May, 1916. Part 2. Last time we saw how Barthas and his comrades were sent to the trenches of the contested Hill 304 in the battlefield of Verdun. It did not take long for the artillery and the machine guns to begin claiming lives among the regiment, including several friends of Barthas. We ended the episode with Barthas going to sleep in the middle of the night while all the hill was carpeted with machine gun fire, and we shall now return to that part of the story. Barthas woke up the next morning to a cold and heavy rain that did not let down and lasted the whole day, showering the poilus. But they did not complain. In fact, they were overjoyed, as for them this rain was a blessing. It made it impossible for the German planes to fly in the sky above Hill 304 like birds of prey, ready to bring death upon them in the shape of guided artillery. In this rain the poilus were finally free to walk around during the day, talk with each other, breathe fresh air, and look for food brought by the ration teams. They would have happily suffered flooded trenches if it meant no enemy planes above them. But nothing lasts forever, and on the morning of May 16th the skies cleared, and soon after the droning of enemy planes could be heard. With this, the poilus were forced to again hide anything and everything that could indicate their presence from the sky. Packs, mess kits, tools, weapons, and the poilus themselves had to disappear from sight, and they could not move until nightfall if they did not want to be spotted and have a torrent of artillery shells unleashed upon them. In vain the soldiers waited and hoped for French pilots to appear and give fight to the Germans. That day, and every day afterwards, the Germans could happily fly in an unchallenged sky, leisurely scouting out their positions in detail. The colonel himself exclaimed, "When we were stationed back in Artois, we were told that German airplanes were being shot down every day in Verdun. Now that we are in Verdun, they tell us that German planes are being shot down every day in Artois." In the afternoon, the German artillery, clearly guided by the airplanes, unleashed a brutal bombardment on Hill 304 that went on non-stop for over 2 hours. Explosions appeared all around them. The detonations made the poilus feel that their heads were going to burst, and it seemed certain they would die within the next minute. Finally, eventually, the bombardment gradually reduced its strength, though at irregular intervals haphazard barrages were still thrown at the hill. At a moment of apparent calm, Barthas and 4 or 5 other comrades gathered under a thin sheet of corrugated iron, which at least gave them the illusion of safety. There they talked about past home leaves, about their families, and about being relieved from that hellhole. Every now and then the conversation was interrupted by nearby explosions that made it impossible to hear anything, but they simply returned to where they had left off as soon as it passed. At that moment a shell suddenly cut right through their metal roof as if it were made of paper, and buried itself into the trench wall before them without detonating. There were 2 seconds of shocked silence, and then everyone burst into laughter. Barthas wrote that he did not know why they laughed. Maybe someone had said something funny before the shell fell. Maybe they were all at the limits of their nerves. Later, at midnight, Barthas, together with 3 comrades and under the command of their corporal, a man called Cazel, went to occupy an observation outpost near the bottom of the frequently bombarded ravine between Hill 304 and Dead Man's Hill. 2 men kept watch while the others worked to clear the collapsed communication trench that was meant to take them back to their half-section. At that moment, and without warning, dozens of small explosions started appearing around them. The poilus dove for cover while the ground around them burst. Barthas wrote that it was a strange weapon that they had never before seen, and never again saw later in the war. They were volleys of small-caliber shells that whistled and cracked like fireworks, exploding into sparks and flames while making a sound like farting. And as they exploded, they threw fragments of iron and rock into the air. It seemed to be some kind of new experimental rapid-fire cannon that the Germans had decided to test on them. The firing lasted for 30 seconds that felt like an eternity, and then stopped. Barthas wrote that these small shells were terrifying, but when the poilus checked on each other, they found that no one had the slightest scratch. The small shells would probably have been far more lethal in open ground. They thought it had all passed and were beginning to laugh at the fright of the moment before, when again the horrible whistling and crackling was heard, and the small shells started falling all around them. But this time they did not stop. They were all flat on the ground under the bombardment, and at that moment Corporal Cazel, who greatly appreciated Barthas's advice and experience as a former corporal, asked him what he thought they should do. Barthas advised that they should get out of the outpost and the hellish bombardment as soon as possible. Everyone else agreed, and they started crawling out of the place, while the small shells rained above them. But the human body is not made for crawling like a slug, and it took them over an hour to cover the 100 meters back to their half-section. It left their whole bodies in agony, and Barthas wrote that, in preparation for the next war to end all wars, school children should be taught every day how to crawl on their bellies, as the knowledge might just prove vital. Finally, as they crawled, they heard a loud snoring that could only belong to their comrade, Private Sabatier, which indicated that they had finally reached the half-section. At that moment, Corporal Cazel started feeling regrets. The orders in Verdun were to face everything that came without giving one step back, and Cazel feared the German army rushing through the unobserved gap. Barthas explained that the German army would not cross that small outpost while every inch of it was being shelled, and that what mattered was that they all looked after each other. That calmed the corporal. At that moment the ration teams arrived at the trench with meals and letters from home. Sabatier's snoring immediately ceased. Barthas wrote that a 420mm shell falling right next to Sabatier would not shake him from his slumber, but the smell of drink would wake him up immediately. The ration teams also brought the good news that they would be relieved the following night, and so the poilus ate and calmed their nerves. Dawn came, and so the soldiers again had to hide away in the holes they had dug at the sides of the trench. Here Barthas and his comrades told the other poilus about their nighttime fright with the small farting shells. The others burst out laughing, but their laughter was short-lived, for soon after and throughout the day they were all attacked with the same infernal small shells. They came without warning. One only heard their crackling and whistling after they had already exploded. A soldier's bag disappeared. Another saw half of his canteen shatter. A heavy howitzer shell exploded nearby, and a man that had piled his rifle cartridges in a small mound saw them all scatter to the wind as several went off. It was horrible, as the volleys of small shells appeared and disappeared without warning. And, to make matters worse, the poilus were all suddenly afflicted with painful diarrhea. As soon as one man recovered, his neighbor was afflicted with it, and had to climb over the trench towards the shell hole that served as their latrine. While at the latrine, one of the soldiers was surprised by a sudden volley of the small shells, and he fell back into his own waist. To try and avoid this fate, some of the soldiers used cans as chamber pots, and one even had to sacrifice his dinner plate. But soon things got even worse. As Barthas wrote that at noon, the Germans unleashed on Hill 304 one of the most violent bombardments he ever saw during the whole war. The air itself was turned into dust and smoke, while amid the dust storm the flashes of shells detonating blinded them. The smell of sulphur and rotting flesh choked them, and the noise was such that it was impossible to tell if the small shells were still exploding around them, or if the French artillery was even answering to this bombardment in any way. And Barthas wrote in shock that they were but a minuscule part of the defences at Verdun. In other places the bombardment was even worse. In that torrent of artillery fire, the trench that communicated their half-section to the command post was almost completely destroyed, while no trace was left of the trench that led to the outpost Barthas and his comrades had occupied the previous night. During the bombardment, Barthas was crouching alone in a small hole that served as his shelter, when suddenly a large shell fell 3 or 4 meters away. The monstrous blast immediately ripped away the small tent cloth that Barthas had put up at the entrance of the shell hole to keep the sun and flies away. Barthas was thrown against the wall by the shock wave. The air left his lungs, and for a few seconds he could not breathe. At that moment, Barthas felt he died. He wrote that others described the wind of death as cold. He felt it burning him through his whole body. But somehow he did not die, though his shell hole collapsed. He crawled out of the collapsed shell hole and immediately went to take shelter 20 meters away at the dugout of Sub-Lieutenant Loriot, their section chief. Barthas wrote that the sub-lieutenant welcomed everyone at his dugout with open arms, but that going there meant admitting that one was afraid, which was surprisingly difficult to do. Barthas wrote that luckily, with the collapse of his shell hole, he had an excuse that would protect his reputation for courage. The sub-lieutenant was sitting down and smoking one cigarette after another. He gave Barthas a small menthol tablet meant for colds and bronchitis, which at least was better than nothing. The sub-lieutenant's dugout was little more than an unfinished German tunnel that was 4 steps deep. Still, the soldiers spent the bombardment there. There was one terrified corporal who jerked his head down at every detonation, until finally the sub-lieutenant told him to stop it. The sub-lieutenant himself couldn't stand being immobile at the bottom of the dugout, and so, during the bombardment, he frequently went off completely alone to visit other section chiefs and the lieutenant, who were often quite far away, with an incredible indifference to the danger around him. In the end, the bombardment cost the half-section 3 wounded, 2 in the head and 1 in the legs. With nightfall, the poilus got their things ready for the relief, but received the unpleasant news that the relief would be postponed by 24 hours. It turned out that a Moroccan Zouave division to their left would attack a German stronghold on Hill 304 at 2 a.m., and they had postponed the relief detail so that it did not run the risk of being hit by the preparatory bombardment. Understandable as it was, the delay was terribly frustrating. Barthas was also told by eyewitnesses that the commander of the Moroccan Zouaves had given the order to his men that they take no prisoners during the attack. Barthas was infuriated, writing that the order was disgraceful and unworthy of a Frenchman. He wrote that, in this way, it was that the Germans, after seeing what happened to those that fell in French hands, resisted to the last, or would massacre those that they captured. In this way, the Germans had dealt with those inside a French first aid station they had captured. The medical officer, the orderlies, and the wounded, all had been executed, some with the butts of rifles. Both Germans and Frenchmen fought each other like savages, and it created an endless cycle of vengeance. Anyone who fell into enemy hands in Hill 304 was unlucky, no matter what side he belonged to. Barthas wrote that he himself once saw a lieutenant shoot at German stretcher-bearers that were carrying a wounded man. When a brave soldier dared to criticize the lieutenant, the officer replied that the Germans would have done the same. And so the cycle of vengeance and brutality continued. But returning to the present, the Zouave attack went off at the appointed hour, and they quickly captured the German stronghold. But soon after, the Germans unleashed a terrible bombardment on the Zouaves. The whole of Hill 304 was turned into a volcano, though Barthas wrote that the small spot his half-section occupied was somehow spared. They watched the storm of explosions all around them. The bombardment was such that the Zouaves had to pull back from their newly captured positions with heavy losses. The Zouaves' commandant and all of their captains were either killed or wounded, and Captain Barbier of Barthas's regiment took control of what was left of the Moroccan battalion. Barthas described Captain Barbier as a man who before the war had been some kind of professor at a university. He had the physique of Hercules, and the all too popular notion among the officers that the soldiers were little more than animals to be treated with no respect, and ordered around as he saw fit. He constantly insulted and punished his men, treating them like dogs. He was not well liked and earned the nickname of the Brute. But despite this, no one could criticize him for a lack of bravery. He was always at the front line, and where the fighting was thickest he could always be seen, shouting and throwing grenades with great strength and skill. Captain Barbier the Brute was the man who tried to organize and fix the front line, establishing outposts and plugging the gaps. Commandant Kansgram and the Kronprinz Kronmeierville cowered and never stuck their noses out of the safety of their shelter 200 meters behind the line. They gave Captain Barbier command of the entire battalion. On the morning of May 18th, the Brute saw how the Germans launched counterattacks and battered the few Zouaves that remained at the stronghold they had captured. He immediately got all excited, preparing the defenses and an attack of his own. He sent men everywhere to bring grenades, ammunition, and flares. At 10 a.m., a few German groups probed the French lines. They were quickly scattered with a few shots, but Captain Barbier was convinced that combat would happen at any moment, and he requested all available reinforcements from the colonel. 2 of the 3 reserve sections of Barthas's company were sent forward across open ground in broad daylight, though they were at least partially protected from the Germans by the thick clouds of smoke from all the shelling on the hill. With the departure of these 2 sections, Barthas's half-section was left completely alone, with their things ready to depart for when they were called by the Brute. The colonel soon also sent up another company from the reserve battalion. The Germans blasted anything that moved on Hill 304 with their artillery, and this was soon made worse by a battery of French 75mm cannons that started shooting too short, hitting the French front line. One of these French shells fell right on Captain Barbier's shelter, killing a Zouave officer. The Brute furiously stamped through the trench, brandishing his revolver while viciously cursing all artillerymen under the heavens, and promising that he would kill the first one that appeared in front of him. Meanwhile, Barthas's half-section lay in wait for the moment when the order came for them to sprint through no man's land towards the brute's positions. Suddenly, a 105mm shell exploded nearby and collapsed part of the trench, burying the privates Jalabert and Sabatier, and leaving them with only their arms and legs sticking out. After a moment of shock, the rest of the poilus were approaching to help when another shell fell so close that all the earth that covered the two men was thrown away. Immediately Jalabert jumped and ran away in mad panic. Sabatier simply got up and commented that his pipe, which he carried at all moments of the day, was busted. Moments later, an orderly appeared with orders that a man from the half-section be immediately assigned to serve as liaison with the command post. Barthas immediately volunteered. Liaison duty was envied on calm days, but on days of attack it was a very dangerous task, as it meant going from one place of the front line to another, carrying messages while the battle raged. But Barthas wrote that despite the dangers involved, he preferred 1,000 times over to die with a dispatch in his hand than with a weapon with which he might have killed another man that was just as unfortunate as himself. If he died, he did not wish to do so with blood on his conscience. Barthas was immediately sent to the liaison shelter that was 50 meters away from the shelter occupied by Commandant Kansgram and Captain Croix-Meyreville. The liaison shelter was little more than a staircase of a dozen steps dug into the ground, and it was already crowded with stretcher-bearers and orderlies. 4 men were busy in a game of manille at the bottom of the shelter. The medics and stretcher-bearers would be idle until nightfall, when they had to go out to find the wounded. There was no space inside for Barthas, so he was forced to stand right at the entrance that connected with the communication trench. From there he saw the sad passing of the reserve company on its way to the front line. Small groups of exhausted and sunburnt men that slowly marched and dropped to the ground whenever a shell fell nearby. They looked around in terror at the hell that was Hill 304. For Barthas, it was an insult how the cynical newspapers wrote of these poor souls, describing the slaughter they were being sent to as a place where the men charged heroically while singing and laughing, eager to give their lives for their country and repelling the German hordes. Some of these men stopped and hid themselves, terrified of going into the slaughter. Some stood at the entrance to the liaison shelter until nightfall, and no one bothered them. Others hid in a half-collapsed shelter that was near the commandant's dugout. At one moment Captain Croix-Meyreville stuck his head out of the dugout, spotted these men, and immediately ordered them to go rejoin their company. The men refused. They would not move until night came. Having no military police to enact his will on Hill 304, the cowardly Captain Adjutant Major immediately disappeared back into his shelter. Barthas overheard a pair of signalmen complaining about how Croix-Meyreville was a complete idiot. He asked them what the Kronprinz had done to them, and the signalmen explained that due to all the shelling, the telephone line was cut over 20 times each day. But despite this, still Meyreville would mercilessly order them to go out immediately and repair the line, no matter how violent the bombardment was at the moment. And so the signalmen had disappeared from the command dugout and were hiding away in the liaison shelter until there was a moment of calm that allowed them to go out and repair the telephone lines. And so time passed. Throughout the day, orderlies or the battalion adjutant would appear at the liaison shelter's entrance. Every time this happened, there was an anxious silence. They would call out the number of a company, and the man assigned to it would have to get up and go to carry his dispatches to the front lines. Many men went pale, but none refused to go. Some never returned. At one moment of the day, Barthas found one of his comrades, Julien Chiffre from Peyriac. The poor soldier had escaped certain death over 10 times. Shaken and pale, he told Barthas that that day had been the worst day of all. At one moment he despaired so much of getting out alive that he had said confession to a passing priest stretcher-bearer, and then stayed on his knees in prayer. Barthas tried to recomfort Chiffre and himself, talking about how the relief would come in the night of the following day. But it was difficult to keep up hopes, as all around them the bombardment increased in strength. Eventually, the day finally ended, though Barthas wrote that no one called him once, so he spent all the day at the entrance to the liaison shelter. He always wondered why he was sent there in the first place. With night, a signalman came to the shelter and told the poilus that the colonel, who was very comfortable and safe in his shelter, had wished to extend the battalion's stay at the front line by 24 hours. But Kansgram and the Couronne Prince, the two cowards who had not put a foot out of their dugout, had shouted in the telephone that the men were completely exhausted and couldn't hold any longer. So the colonel authorized the relief. As each unit's replacement arrived throughout the night and the next day, they would have to make their way back to the forest of Saint-Pierre on their own. The replacements of the liaison unit arrived that same night at 11 p.m. But they were supposed to stay there and wait for Kansgram and the Kronprinz, who did not wish to get out of their shelter until the bombardment calmed down. As the impatient and scared soldiers waited around the shelter, a few shells burst above them, one piece of shrapnel hitting Barthas's helmet. These shells usually announced the imminent arrival of the even deadlier armor-piercing shells. With these explosions, some men immediately ran off and disappeared in the darkness. Barthas told his comrade Chiffre that he was fed up with the commandant and the captain adjutant major. He would leave this place now, and so the two of them left on their own. The main communication trench could take them to the base of Hill 304 within 10 minutes, but they found the path turned into pure chaos as a veritable avalanche of shells fell on it, blocking the path completely. The only way to get to the bottom of the hill would be to take a long detour, and this was what they did. In the darkness they had to go through a butchered landscape where over 20 battles had been fought. Everywhere there were corpses, broken pieces of gear, collapsed tree trunks, large shell holes, and lines and bundles of barbed wire. They had to clamber over or crawl under the wire, and it would tear their skin and get stuck on their clothes. The emptiness of the place was unnerving. If they got lost, they simply turned their backs to the flares and explosions of the front line. All that mattered was to get as far away from the battle as possible, and towards the safety of the rear. Chiffre was exhausted and ill, afflicted with bronchitis and asthma, so every now and then he had to stop to catch his breath. Barthas used these pauses to scout out a path ahead of them. The terrified Chiffre would soon start calling out to him, fearing being abandoned in the darkness. Still, in this graveyard shells fell frequently, forcing Barthas and Chiffre to get down to the ground as soon as they heard the sinister whistling. In the darkness they also spotted the shadows of other men who, like themselves, were trying to get to safety. On their way down, and right as a new bombardment of that slope was beginning, Barthas and Chiffre heard a voice behind them, commanding them to stop. Any second spent still was a second when they could be killed by the shelling, so both poilus played deaf. Again the voice called out, and they ignored it. Suddenly, Barthas found himself with a revolver pressed under his nose, and an angry voice saying that if he took one more step he would be a dead man. To the side, Another stranger was shaking Chiffre by his neck. For a moment Barthas wondered if they were being attacked by men who had completely lost their minds. There were plenty of those in Hill 304. But he soon recognized Sub-Lieutenant Roch of the 23rd Company, an officer under the command of the terrible brute, Captain Barbier. Barthas described the sub-lieutenant as a typical young officer who was strong, brave, yet immature and prideful. A man who treated soldiers as inferiors and who could at one moment be laughing with the men and at the next moment punishing them cruelly. A man as equally capable of terrible acts of selfishness and cowardice as of acts of heroism, depending on the circumstances and how drunk he was. Outraged at the sub-lieutenant's impolite greeting, Barthas raised his rifle and pointed it at the officer, then told him, "Sir, you've got your revolver and I've got my rifle. What do you want us to do now?" The sub-lieutenant immediately swore that he had never intended to use his revolver on the poilus. He just wanted, like Captain Barbier, to shoot the first artilleryman he found, a thing that he never ended up doing. The officer explained that he had seen the two poilus moving downhill at speed, so he had assumed they knew where they were going and wanted them to guide his orderly and himself to the base of Hill 304. And so the four of them, Barthas, Chiffre, Sub-Lieutenant Roch, and the sub-lieutenant's orderly, made their way down the hill. They soon found a poilu that was completely covered in canteens, cooking pots, pans, and platters, a rationer carrying all of his cooking equipment, and whom Barthas and Chiffre soon recognized to their great joy as the poilus Paul Alpert. Finally, the five of them found the road at the bottom of Hill 304. They were not far enough from the battle yet to be completely safe from the German cannons, but at least here they could rest a bit. Completely exhausted and starving, they all collapsed next to the road. Suddenly, the smell of coffee, soup, and garlic reached their noses. In the darkness they had not seen that right nearby the field kitchens were set up, waiting for the ration teams. Immediately, despite his exhaustion, Barthas managed to get up and headed towards the blessed food carts. And so we reach the end of the 10th notebook. Barthas and his comrades have suffered non-stop shelling in Hill 304, and have already lost many men, either killed or wounded. It is difficult to imagine that this was but a minuscule part of the Battle of Verdun, and that the slaughter would go on non-stop for almost 10 months. But, at least for now, Barthas and his comrades are relieved from Hill 304. In the next notebook we shall see what the future has for them in this war, a 4-year war that by this point has not reached its 2nd year. I will see you on the next episode, and until then, I hope you all stay safe and have a good day.